just to give you a roadmap as to where we're going to be dividing the material up really with a lot of overlap and back and forth. But the idea is April will be talking about the role of historical texts, and Kendra will be looking at sacred texts. And throughout, we'll be discussing the processes of reading hope and trauma in the pandemic.
I'm not sure why, but Laura cuts out for me. Is that the same for other people? How about raising your hand if it is? Okay. Anybody have an idea as to what could be causing that? Let me unmute you.
Well, you know, it's the kind of thing that might come and go occasionally.
Okay,
and
so let's keep going.
We'll press on, yeah, but do let me know if it goes on too long. So this presentation really comes out of an interest in healthcare humanities, which is something that several of us on the La Sierra campus have been thinking about for lots of reasons, partly because of our historical relationship with Loma Linda and the idea that we're sort of the liberal arts school that kind of has this sister relationship with Loma Linda as a healthcare institution. And in
screen mirroring.
becoming becoming an area of interest for a lot of us.
I don't know how to do it before we got a new TV.
1 second. I'm trying to get you all muted here.
Let's see.
Let's try that.
Got you. I think that works. So the idea of healthcare humanities has a lot of components to it. Those bubbles above the healthcare humanities line kind of represent some of the more academic aspects of it. It's an interesting new area for medical training to be really bringing the skills of humanities to the discussion of what it means to practice medicine. And then there's also these really interesting studies being done on the intersections of literature, history, and art in terms of science, the history of science, the literature of science, the art of science, that sort of thing. And sort of underneath that line represents some of the more creative production sorts of parts of healthcare humanities. There's a movement to really embrace and encourage patient and caregiver narratives. So patients writing about their experiences for the sake of sort of having healthcare providers better understand. And on the flip side, really caregivers, doctors, nurses, allied health workers, writing about their experience partly as a way of sort of managing their emotions and processing them. And really these two groups reading one another's works. And then finally, the idea of sort of the visual arts in healthcare. And I've just given you this example of a mural by Tilda Shaloff. She is a registered nurse. She worked for many years in a variety of areas involving taking care of cancer patients and very seriously ill people. And over the years while she was working, she would be, you know, undoing vials or medicines or different sort of pieces of equipment. And she started to collect the clean pieces of trash that came off of those things, the little lids, the tops, and she put them in her uniform pocket. And at the end of the day, she would sort of throw them in a bag. Well, over the years, she got a lot of these collected, and she got to thinking as she was nearing retirement that she wanted to do something with them that would be representative of the experience that she'd had throughout her career. And this mural is the result of it. You can get a sense of the scale of it in the picture at the bottom. We see her standing in front of it, talking about it. You can Google her and find an interesting video online where she talks about this image. I think just as we're looking at it together here, you can see there's a variety of scales involved. So you have the human scale with the patients at the kitty corner, the faces, and the focus on their breathing, respiration, and all of the their veins, all of the sorts of bodily processes that as a nurse she was so involved in supporting. But we also have the molecular level with the shapes that are more in the middle, the cells, the different bodily molecular level entities, the way viruses might work and that sort of thing. So this combination, I think, is a really beautiful example of that more creative side of healthcare humanities. So in all of this, there was a desire to kind of think about how can we apply some of these intersections to the curriculum that we offer at La Sierra University. And so there's been a few classes that have come out. I had a chance to teach a science and literature class last spring, a year ago, to upper division English majors and graduate students. But just this last quarter, got to teach for the first time a new class that was targeted at the lower division general education student. It was an existing class called Humanities, Exploring American Culture Through Literature and the Visual and Performing Arts. Its main task is to have the general education student become exposed to the skills of the humanities with a high focus on the reading of cultural texts and of course writing about them. So as I was thinking about teaching this class with my co-teacher, who's a little bit covered up here, you may know her well, Dr. Katie Coe is well known in our community. She's a historian, church historian, a British specialist, as I am on the literature side. So it was interesting for us to get paired up to teach this American culture class. But she was game, and what we decided to do was to have a special focus on reading cultural texts that reflect major health events in American history. And we were slated to teach this for the first time in winter quarter 2020, and that quarter runs from January to March. And so we began that class in January with really hardly an inkling in the news yet about the coronavirus. It was something maybe you'd heard about as something happening elsewhere. But what's really fascinating, what we want to kind of think about together today, is the way that that class unfolded, even as we were looking at the history of all these things, that we had a current event happening that really became a very interesting touch point for Dr. Coe and I to really experience this whole process and the class with the undergraduates at La Sierra University. So to give you a sense of the scope of the class as a whole, these were the 7 topics that we looked at, and in order throughout the 10-week plus a finals week, so 11-week quarter, this is what we were looking at. At the start of the quarter, we had a...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you sharing your screen now? Because all we see, not that that is enough, is your face.
So we're not.
Really?
We're not.
Oh, I'm so glad you stopped me. I
can
think
see.
I was.
Well, I'm seeing the screen.
Your face.
I'm seeing the screen.
Well,
Okay.
what's the difference?
Well, we're using an iPad, so
Is it?
we'll
Is
go to
I
another.
think if you use your laptop, it might be better.
Or could you move the face around? Like if you pick up my face and move it to the side, might it reveal the slides?
Look. Go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Actually, you gave me a good opportunity to just go back slightly. I did want to explain this picture here. What you see is a patient that has been brought to an art exhibit. And what it was an intentional experience that the hospital, this was in Europe, what they did is they brought terminally ill patients to see a Rembrandt show of his works that he created in his own final days. So it became this really fascinating experience of end-of-life patients looking at end-of-life art. And this is, I think, an example of the intersections that we're looking at in particular here. So let me just pick up then here. So here were the topics that we were doing throughout the quarter. At the beginning of the quarter, while we were kind of doing the overview and preparing the students to think about the material, we did a survey and we said, of these 7 topics, which are the ones that you're most looking forward to learning about? I mean, this is, I think, just good practice when you're particularly teaching a class for the first time to try and build in a lot of feedback opportunities. So I was really intrigued when that survey came back, and 75% of the about 55 students in the class all picked topic 4. And their reasons they gave was, well, mental illness is something that's still relevant today. So again, keep in mind, this is week 1 of January, something like that. I think out of all those 55, there was only 1 student who picked, yeah, influenza, that sounds interesting. And certainly the relevance of something like the pandemic of 1918 kind of unfolded as we went through the quarter with the coronavirus. But That wasn't where we started. Another aspect of the class really was to attempt to appeal to students' multiple intelligences, their majors, their interests. So we were looking really at a variety of things that we identified as texts. So those texts might be newspaper articles, public messaging. They could actually also be the way clothing from a time is something as a text you can read as well. Material culture. So that example there is one of the alarms, the gas alarms that were used in the trenches in World War I to warn soldiers of what was coming. And we spent a great deal of time also on paintings as well. And overall, the task was to help students learn new techniques of reading, that we kind of gave these metaphors of slow reading, deep reading, wide reading, was really pointing at things like really not surface reading, slowing down, spending time with the text, but looking deeply at the details. And then the wide idea having to do with really the context, and really spent quite a bit of time building out that sense of what it means to read in context. And here's an example of how some of that worked. So for instance, we looked at this painting by John Sargent called Gas. He's an American artist. He was commissioned by the British government to commemorate the Great War. And it's an impressive piece. If you think about it being 9 feet wide and 21 feet long, you have a picture there at the bottom of our classroom, and the picture presented there. This is a student later in the quarter giving a presentation on this piece of art. But to have these sort of visual things to bring the students back to these historical moments, and to really the sense of what chemical warfare in World War I meant for the soldiers, and then to be able to read that painting in the context of poems such as Wilfred Owen's very famous poem about mustard gas in World War I as well, and to have that poetry read through the painting and so forth. And we also talked about reading in community in the sense of taking a look at the quote here from Winston Churchill, his response to the gas painting as well, and to really model all of this sort of reading in various ways. Another thing that we talked about was really reading the changing perceptions of medical science throughout this period, through each of these different significant events in medical history, to really look at the way medical science itself was perceived. We took a look and studied this painting by Luke Fildes, and really studied the way that the details in it refer to sort of a moment in the transition of medicine that really took place importantly just prior to the 1918 influenza pandemic. Before the Civil War, Europe was way ahead of America in terms of what we would say now is good practice in medical science. Things started the Civil War actually brought a lot of new advances, but it's interesting that it's really the opening of Johns Hopkins University Medical School that becomes the first time when American medical education really tried to mirror the much more scientific approach that we were seeing in Europe at the time. And it's interesting to put that timing in the context of a painting like Fildes's, because it actually had a popular culture aspect to it. There were 1 million copies of engravings of this painting sold in America at the time. It tells you something about the interest in the subject, and it's interesting, the painter really was modeling this scene after the death of his own 1-year-old son, and the experience that he had despite the loss of his son. He was very impressed with the dedication of the doctor that took care of him at the time, and this painting is something of a tribute to that. It's also interesting to see the medicine bottle on the table next to the lamp. It's telling you something about the development of this sort of treatment at the time. And of course, the metaphor of how light is used in the room is interesting. We've got sort of the light of knowledge, that artificial light that is shining down on the doctor, but we also have the natural light coming through the window. Kind of it's early morning. The suggestion is that this child is about to get better. It's interesting that though his own son died, his painting is a focus on a child getting better. And so these were the sorts of things that we were looking at as we were kind of preparing the students to think about the 1918 influenza pandemic and where we were as a nation with our medical treatment at that time. So then as we were looking here, we really wanted them throughout the quarter to read events in context of one another. So we had spent as our first topic really looking at tuberculosis. And believe it or not, when you look at that list of 7 topics, there's lots of art that's been done about each of those topics. So it was a little surprising to me even as we started to see how much there was. But there's a lot of representation of tuberculosis patients in the 19th century. And the kind of association, we looked at the historical context of TB as an illness really being seen as having a certain amount of shamefulness to it, a fear that it's hereditary, that there's something kind of that you have a sense of blame and responsibility for it. That was sort of part of the culture of that illness at that time. And then we moved into 1918 and really seeing how that particular illness really focused on the young in a way that the typical flu hadn't, that people were familiar with, and the associations of that, of course, also with World War II or World War I as what we deemed it the chemists' war, because it made so many, it made use of chemistry in such a way, and that so there was this increasing sense of a sort of scientific nature to war, but also its very lethal quality for the young. So again, we were with the students sort of talking about how history needs to be read in context of other events. Well, and so with the influenza issue, when we got there, last week, David had mentioned that we'd be talking about literature, so I have to give you a little bit of poetry here. This was a popular children's jump rope song from 1919, and it said, "I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window in influenza." So it was fascinating to think about how children at the time and their culture and how they were coping with this illness that they were seeing so much of in this kind of jump rope song. The other thing we were able to do was to look at well-known pieces of art like the Scream here by Edvard Munch, and our students tend to know that one. It has a certain level of popular quality, popular culture recognition. And so it was fascinating to be able to show them that same artist and his work that was a self-portrait after the Spanish influenza, and to really note even this iconic skull that we think of with the Scream, and to what extent it bears similarity to his own self-portrait. In the wake of having recovered, but having experienced the Spanish influenza. And of course, we looked at the way statistics from the time really kind of told a story, and how this bump with the solid line really talked about the fact that the influenza pandemic of 1918 took the young in a way that was not typical for them. So again, in all ways, we were trying to put different sorts of contexts around everything that they were reading. And here was the part we didn't plan, of course. We ended up having a context of current events to what we were looking at. So I wanted to include this slide just to remind us all, it feels like eons ago now, but if you look back at these late January information that actually got included in a slide in class, you can see here the numbers. It's a little hard for you to read, so I'll note here. At this date, the United States had 5 cases and 0 deaths. And so that was kind of where we were at first. It was just sort of coming to our consciousness. We did talk in class about maps. We compared a few different maps and sort of the visuals that were associated with it. And we talked about how this one was a particularly alarming kind of image, the way the colors work, and the idea that even though there were only 5 cases in America, the whole country, including Alaska and all of that, everything was red, and you know, the sorts of messaging that went with that. So that became another context for us to be reading in. And then we were looking at the specific images with the different events. So in looking at the public health messaging of 1918, we looked at this iconic picture of the Seattle trolley that we had in our title page for you, and really looking, we imagine it was probably a staged kind of a situation, but you can see that the trolley director is refusing entry to this man who is holding the packaging. He is not wearing a mask. mask. And, the message was, if you were going to ride, you needed to wear a mask. And it was interesting to connect that to the language in the poster there that, if possible, walk to work, cover each cough and sneeze, avoid crowds, do not spit. It was interesting how often spitting comes up as the highlighted public messaging of that time. And then we were comparing that to the way the medical profession, medical science was being represented in some of this imagery. So here we have the suited man with his sort of black doctor's bag and his net, and he's going to capture the flu pandemic. So it's interesting, that sort of heroic look at the medicine at the time. Again, that was really, it was through this particular illness that science was beginning to really question the idea of the bacteria versus virus. This is really an important moment for the shift in that area. The other interesting overlap with the World War I here is this image where we have a kind of non-gender specific, I think, I could almost see either male or female, figure called sanitation, holding up the lamp of medical knowledge. And in this case, doing that to shine a light on the soldier from World War I. So talking about all this visual messaging, the language messaging, and yet even in that early part of the quarter, we were starting to see our own public health messaging. You'll recall that really those early messages focused quite a lot on the issue of hand washing. So, we noticed in 1918, there was a lot about don't spit on the street. And, at the time it was easy for us to think, well, that's kind of funny that was something that people had to be taught. And yet here we were being taught in 2020 how to properly wash hands and to sing the birthday song in 20 seconds. And like suddenly we were getting a lot of that messaging early, still in the quarter. Ultimately the message about the stay home, stay healthy was a little bit later on, but this was an important context for us to be reading, and it was quite fascinating to be experiencing all of this with young people. Our students were mostly in the 18 to 22 range, not all freshmen certainly, kind of representative of all the classes, but also lots of different majors, and to just see how they were absorbing this history, the humanities, the arts, and yet also kind of having that as a context for how they were reading the present. It really became an interesting issue. So I am thinking about how it was to teach that class this past quarter, as things were emerging. And I'm really anticipating what it will be like a year from now. Dr. Coe and I are scheduled to teach this class again next winter, January 2021. And then we'll be dealing with a group that are very familiar with virus, will have that context. Fascinating to read masks then and now, that sort of thing. Also thinking about their cultural responses, what we're seeing now versus what we saw then. When we think about what has kind of come out as memorable about the 1918 pandemic, we really do think of this iconic Spanish flu reference, which is a kind of misnomer. We know that flu was all over Europe, it was in America, but the fact that Spain was not involved in World War I, their media was covering it more, whereas all the countries involved in World War I were sort of trying to tamp down the idea that the illness was in their country, because it was basically would make their armies seem weak, and there was a strong political motivation to not talk about it. And so it was easier to refer to it as the Spanish flu, and we've tended to hold on to that description since then. And I'm just anticipating what will be the kind of tagline or the thing that comes out of the coronavirus experience we're having that will be that kind of icon going forward. And I'm just guessing that this red sphere that we tend to see everywhere as a representation of the coronavirus might be one of those things that we'll be studying a year from now. Like, what does that mean? How does that compare to those maps that were in red and black and white? And what are the kind of cues that come out of that sort of thing. This is a picture we'll come back to in just a moment, but we remember that in contrast here. So as I just added this material from this week to give us a sense of where we've come since that map earlier in the quarter. You can see how the numbers have changed. I think it's interesting that there is this new data point of total tests conducted in the US. You know, that wasn't part of the imagery and kind of packaging of this pandemic early on. And so to look at that idea, well, testing is kind of this hopeful thing that we're balancing with the deaths. And I've also seen in some coverage, it'll be about the number of people who've recovered as a kind of counterpoint to the death. And so it's interesting to see how these numbers are coming together. I think the other thing that will be interesting next year is to trace the role of even how Johns Hopkins University has been an important touch point for this pandemic. It tends to be the main source for numbers that lots of outlets used, and to think about that in comparison to the way that medical school was, you know, its beginnings really came out of the 1918 pandemic as well. So it was interesting when we got to the final exam this past winter for this class. It was about the middle of March, and our administration at the university during week 10 of the quarter, the last regular class week, sent out the word that faculty needed to prepare to give our final exams online, which would have been week 11. And this was before we had heard yet from the county about the shutdown. In fact, we had that week, which I'm so thankful the administration gave us that. We needed that week to think through all those processes, because that Friday we did get the word that we needed to shelter in place. So I was really grateful to have had that heads up. So here we started the quarter not even being aware too much about the coronavirus, but then by final exam week, the students were in a shelter in place, taking their exam online. Our worlds had changed. And as I was writing the final exam and thinking about how could we bring the skills that the students had been practicing with reading to apply to what we were experiencing, I decided to pick this image that I had shown you a moment ago. It's by David Godsell. He is a biologist and an artist. He has had, this is part of what he calls a series of molecular landscapes. He's basically pictured, drawn some of the most famous viruses in recent years. And he got busy and made this coronavirus pretty quickly at the beginning of this year. And so I included that as an image for the students to have as an option for analysis on the final exam. And it was fascinating to think about those students suddenly taking their final exams in a way that they had not expected from off campus. As faculty, Dr. Coe and I, we were not where we expected to be as we were grading those finals. And I was so moved really by several of the answers that were submitted, the way that the students were able to take what they had learned historically and to apply it to a response to this picture of this virus that was at that point really starting to change our lives, and to be able to make an aesthetic response to something that was actually impacting them personally. And I was impressed at how many of their answers really focused on a kind of hopefulness. In a sense, I think learning about the 1918 event gave them a sense that this is not it's not a new thing. The world's gone through this before. And I was so pleased to see the amount of hope and comfort that they had taken from it. So this is my final slide. I wanted to include this. This was art that was represented through the La Sierra University Church during its 4 Days of Jesus for the Easter celebration. And when I saw it, you can imagine I got very excited, because I was thinking about teaching that humanities class next year, and I was thinking I need to find some coronavirus art, and here it is. So Crystal Chavez is an alumna of La Sierra University, graphic design, 2017. She is currently working now as a graphic designer for it's a kind of a school that helps people finish their high school diplomas who don't want the GED. And so she works on all the messaging and material communication for that kind of dropout recovery program. But she was asked by La Sierra University Church to produce some art that they could display during those 4 days. I think is just a beautiful example of a young person responding to this epidemic, this pandemic, with some really thoughtful imagery. We won't go into too much detail. Maybe if we have time in discussion, we could come back to it. But I'll just you know, the vulnerability piece, she talked to me about it, and she said those faces are just about life size in the actual piece, and she talked about what it meant to draw those faces, and suddenly those eyes are looking back at her and thinking about the different kinds of masks, and it was kind of her thank you to the frontline medical workers as she was doing that. I think that idea of the honesty one that really shows the connection of the media coverage and what that meant in the shelter in place moment. We've got this connection between two people happening even as the news is behind. But I must say my favorite of all of them really is the hope. The idea that she expressed hope through these clasped hands that needed to wear gloves, and she talked about that this might be a healthcare worker trying to connect to a family member, it might be two loved ones, but you know, she really saw it as a sign that maybe we'll, you know, this new future, we don't know what it's going to be like, but hopefully it will continue to include this kind of human contact. So now, having kind of walked through these issues of kind of being with students and learning history and kind of absorbing what that means in terms of current events, I now want to pass this off to my colleague, April Summitt. She's the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and she's going to talk with us about how the 1918 pandemic really has a record of silence in history as well. So please, April.
Thank you, Laura. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I see a thumbs up, that's great. When we talk about history, we talk about all the kinds of things that Laura was showing us in her slideshow. We talk about art, poetry, music, of course, diaries, legal documents, official historical records, photographs, and what have you. And music is part of my favorites in terms of evidence of the past, what kinds of songs people sang at the time and so forth. But in contrast to music and sound, one of the things that historians need to learn to do is to examine the silences. It's always a challenge to teach students about silence and what we mean when we talk about silence. The record of the 1918 flu pandemic is an interesting one because while there's a lot of evidence available and a lot of photographs that we can find and look at and so forth, the books themselves, the history books, particularly the textbooks, are very, very silent for a very long time. So studying that silence by itself is an interesting thing. Why? Why is it missing from so many of the textbooks? And if Laura will move the slide for me. My next picture is a picture of the emergency hospital camp at Fort Riley, Kansas, where they think that the virus first manifested. We're not sure exactly, but that's one of the theories. And the reason why I asked to put that photograph up is to give us an idea of the scope of the horror of the pandemic at that time. This is the kind of source that we usually expect to see when we look at the past and examine what people were doing, especially since the invention of photography. We look at the frame of a picture, what's left out, what's included in it, and so forth. But it's a little bit unusual to talk about a time period, an event that was so horrific without looking at photographs and so forth. If you can move to the next slide, I want to show you some textbooks that were used in high schools and early college years in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. The book on the left by David Muzzy, this one, that book was first published in 1911. This particular picture is from a 1920. And I'm going to show you a picture of my own personal copy in just a moment. But that particular book on the left by Muzzy remained popular, very popular, well into the 1960s in terms of a textbook that high schools and academies used throughout the country. And similarly, Harold Rugg's book on the right from the 1930s. It didn't stay around quite as long because he was a little bit controversial, was a little bit too sympathetic toward labor unions, for example. So eventually his book fell out of favor. But both of these books really failed to mention in any significant way at all anything about the 1918 flu epidemic. If you'll move to the next slide, I'll show you my copy. This was my mother's textbook in academy, 1959, David Muzzey's A History of Our Country. And all the little drawings and scribbles were part of what made it precious to me, because it showed my mother doodling when she was in academy. But what's fascinating about this book is the absence of any reference to the 1918 epidemic of any real sort. Sure, the Great War, World War I, was talked about at length. A lot of the narrative is about how we rose to the occasion. We went over to Europe to help them fight their battle and finally win it for them, how we sacrificed in order to do that, and then how we came home and dealt with our own challenges and then moved on from there. But there's really no discussion about the 1918 flu epidemic at all. Moving on to the next slide, there's a couple of excerpts of this particular textbook. On the left is really the only hint that you have that maybe there was something going on. It was actually a photograph of the deportation of a group of Reds. That's an important thing to keep in mind when we think about when this book was written and when the students were reading it. This was about a group of suspected Reds or Russians that were sent back to Russia because they were spreading seditious communist ideas here in the United States. But I include it in particular because if you look very carefully at the photograph, it's a little hard to see. You can see a lot of the people in that photograph wearing white face masks, which gives you a hint of the time period we're talking about. That is the only representation of face masks in the entire textbook. It's the only place you see that. The excerpt that you see on the right-hand side is as close as you get to any kind of real mention when you talk about the end of the war. The highlighted text says, "The immediate result of the war, however, was a period of 2 or 3 years of such political, economic, and social confusion as usually follows a great war." So in a lot of ways, that wraps up for the textbook author what might have been going on at the time. Sure, it was a tough war. We had to come home. People were a little bit upset about some of the economic impact, the political impact. But as you can see, no real mention here of anything having to do with flu epidemics. If you can move to the next slide. These are a couple more excerpts from this same textbook. I particularly like on the left-hand side, the way epidemic is referred to in this textbook. It talks about industrial turmoil. The generous truce between capital and labor came to an abrupt end as soon as the emergency need for cooperation in winning the war had passed. A perfect epidemic of strikes broke out in 1919, involving 4 million workers and costing $2 billion of loss in sales and wages. So using the term epidemic here is associated with labor strikes, a terrible thing nobody wanted to think about, and certainly talking about labor strikes and labor unions at the time that this textbook was being read in the 1940s, 1950s, well, that it seemed to smack of communist influences. So we always had to be suspicious of labor strikes. It's just an interesting use of the word epidemic here and associating it not with a disease, not with a virus or bacteria, but with labor strikes. And then on the right-hand side, this is really the only reference to disease in this textbook at this time period. In the middle of the page, it's talking about the end of World War I. fewer than 50,000 of our soldiers were killed in battle, somewhat over 50,000 died of disease at home and abroad. So that is really the only reference to the 1918 flu epidemic in this textbook that was used well into the 1960s in high schools, American high schools across the country. So an interesting silence that you have to delve into a little bit and think about why. Why is it not showing up? If we advance to the next slide, it's not just textbooks in the 50s, 60s, early 70s perhaps, that leave out the story of the 1918 flu epidemic, but esteemed scholars in the field of history that graduate students were reading weren't writing about it either for quite some time. These three works represent three esteemed historians in the field. I had to read all three of those particular textbooks when I was doing my PhD education. And DeSantis on the left-hand side was written in 1973, Hawley, 1992, and then Leuchtenberg, 1993. So we're into the 1990s, and although there has been some writing about the flu epidemic by this point, none of these three very important works in the field reference the 1918 flu epidemic at all. It's completely silent, which of course gives a lot of interesting questions to ponder. Why is it not there at all? Move on to the next slide, if you will. So when we're thinking about the silences, we have to ask ourselves the big question: why? Why? The students are always befuddled by this. Well, why is it not showing up in the textbooks? This is not an easy question to answer, but when we think of context for photographs, for pieces of art, for diaries, for any historical piece of evidence, we ask what the motives were for the writers. What was the context in which they were writing at the time? The first reaction that most students give as to why there are silences is, well, it was too painful, it was too traumatic, so nobody wanted to talk about it. They're right. That was a certain amount of the situation. The generation that survived didn't want to talk about the trauma of the 1918 flu epidemic to those children who were growing up and inheriting the world after the Great War and after the epidemic. There were a lot of other things to think about. There was the war, of course, and what that meant to global nationalism, the Great Depression that came not that long after, then World War II and so forth. And you go down the road of history to the Cold War era. That helps give us a little bit of an answer as to why the silence is there in those textbooks. Sure, in the 1920s and 30s, people weren't willing to really engage the trauma of the recent past very much. But by the time you get to the 40s and 50s, you think maybe this would be showing up a little bit in the writing. And although it's overwhelmed perhaps by World War II and Cold War, the fact of Cold War is very significant here, because the 1950s was all about making sure we were raising good, strong American citizens who would be fighting against the awful evils of communism, that America was special. This was always a theme in American history, the idea of American exceptionalism. Especially by the turn of the 20th century, we have just before that Frederick Jackson Turner talking about the experience of the American frontier being that experience that made America so special and suited to rule the world and to have a superior civilization to everyone else. So we were already used to thinking about manifest destiny, divine destiny for a nation state. So it was natural to see that continue as we encountered another period of uncertainty. What's going to happen in this Cold War as time goes by? What's going to happen with the Soviets having nuclear weapons? Are we going to have a nuclear holocaust? What is our future going to mean? It's natural to then look at the things that make you feel strong, and flu epidemics that no one seemed to have any control over was not one of those things. You wanted to think about victory in war, the ability to rebuild economies, to dominate a global economy, to grow a globalized presence in the world, to replace the imperial powers that had faded away at the end of World War I, to a new American empire, if you will. So the textbooks in the 1950s are going to talk about how wonderful America is, how horrible communism is, how strong America is. So there's some of the explanations we can come up with as to why the silence was so strong. It's not really until we get into the 1970s that begins to change. And of course, I would ask students at this point, why the 1970s? And I'm sure that if all of you were answering the question, you would say, oh, Vietnam or something like that. And that would be right. It was the experience of the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement and the unrest and the violence we saw surrounding that in the 1960s and 70s made us begin to question American exceptionalism. Finally made people think perhaps America didn't always have it right. Maybe we did make mistakes. Maybe we are in danger of something horrible happening to us in the future. Maybe it's not all a special divine inspired history in front of us that will always be free of conflict and losing battles and so forth. So the 1970s does make us stop and question, and that's why historians begin to dig into some of the subjects that we've not always looked at in the past, like the 1918 flu epidemic. In fact, one of the first works on that subject comes out 1976, I believe, by Alfred Crosby, who many consider the father of environmental history, which is my area of specialty now. And Crosby, his most famous work in 1973, wrote about the Columbian Exchange. So most of his focus was not on the pandemic, but he naturally went down that road because he was so interdisciplinary in his work. He was studying typical historical texts, but biology, geology, lots of other ologies. And what Crosby does is really bring our attention to a horrible traumatic episode of our history that killed more Americans in any of the 20th century wars combined. And that's really hard for someone to wrap their minds around when it's been such a silent topic. It's one that's just disappeared from our conversation for such a long time. So finally, in the 1970s, as we begin to look at things that were perhaps not as heroic a story as we had celebrated in the past, we started to see some history written about the 1918 influenza epidemic. That has increased into the early part of the 21st century, mostly because we've been able to do some genome sequencing finally. 2007, I believe, is about the right time period for that. Attention to our advances in medical science and so forth is one frame to use to talk about this previous epidemic. I have to emphasize at this point how hopeless people felt during that flu epidemic. The diaries, the stories, the interviews that we have been able to preserve over the past, even though these kinds of things don't show up in the history books very much. We can find them now. When we go look for the evidence, we can find the photographs, of course. We can find the stories. Some of the interviews that were done by with young children before they pass away, we don't have them with us anymore. But preserving those oral histories and so forth, we listen to the the underlying fear in all of that. We listen when we're even reading words or seeing photographs. We hear the trauma, the fear that was so strong, not just because it was an epidemic and people were dying, but because even though America was great and loved to think of itself that way, and strongest in the world, so we believed, and of course, time seemed to demonstrate that that was indeed the fact. In spite of all of this evidence of primacy, exceptionalism, and power, this was something we had no control over. That was a hard story for people to tell. And so it takes a long time for that part of the story to enter our narrative, our historical narrative later on. But it does. And so now we think about this pandemic, and particularly now because 100 years later, we have yet another one. We don't know how it's going to compare to this 1918 pandemic, which was extremely strong and deadly. We don't know. So far, we're hoping this one seems to be perhaps less deadly, but it's a hard thing to say when we have people losing loved ones around us. Fear will always be there when it's something like a virus or bacteria that we don't seem to have any kind of solution for, a clear remedy for, and certainly not a vaccine yet. But we do look back at this experience now, and we think about the fact that we survived, and it brings us hope. I would say that that's the gift of historical memory, that we can look back at experiences that have happened, and we can say, in this particular case for sure, well, we've gone through something horrible before, and we will make it through this one. So one of the benefits of digging up the past and hearing those silences is to bring us that hope, and very specifically hope that's coming to us now from examples of community. The stories that come out of 1918 are many stories about how they fed each other, how they took care of each other, how they served those around them with no doctors to help, or the doctors were getting sick too. The doctors tried very hard, the nurses, but family members, parents, children taking care of parents, the emphasis on community, and that community was the way through the horrible experience of the 1918-1919 flu epidemic. And I think that's an important historical story of hope for us today. All right, with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Kendra.
Speaking of hope, we're going to open this up in a few moments for conversation, but I just want to share with you a few ideas before we do. I'm grateful to my husband for sharing this article with me, this recent article by Saban Hegarty, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Why Religious Apocalyptic Texts Can Offer Us Solace During this crisis, during this coronavirus crisis. I appreciate this article because it's for lay people, but it also, in its focus on trying to share Jewish apocalyptic literature in ways that are helpful to lay people, it does so by not moving away from the idea of what those earliest Jewish apocalyptic texts were trying to do, and to not just go to what people do with those texts today. That during times of oppression, and during times of injustice, and during times of violence, and yes, during times of illness, when people were asking, is this all there is? The answer of these texts respond with a resounding no. No, this isn't all there is. That God has the last word. And I appreciate so much the way in which we've been encouraged to think about the ways in which art and even memory and history can bring us hope. I was driving the 91 this week, and on my iPod came the song The Prayer by Andre Bocelli and Celine Dion. And there was something about it, driving the 91 with so few cars, I don't know, the week that I'd had, I'm not sure what all, but I found it very emotional to be listening to the words, especially this part, let this be our prayer when shadows fill our day. And it seems like they were not just praying for themselves. It wasn't a personal prayer. It was a prayer for the globe. It was a prayer for all of us in a way, for all of people. And it seems to me that's one of the things that art does. It expands from just a personal experience to a more global shared experience. And it seems to me that's what the book of Revelation is. It's a work of art that is expanding in the scope of its vision. Just a couple of ideas that I know we've talked about in some contexts before, but I just think it's a good reminder about prophecy and apocalyptic. Just one major idea. It's the next slide. That to recall the idea that prophecy is not primarily foretelling the future as much as forthtelling in the here and now. That works that are looking into what prophecy is make this observation, that for Jewish prophetic literature and then into Christian prophetic literature as well, it's not so much about foretelling the future as forthtelling in the here and now. And since apocalyptic literature is a child of prophetic literature, I would suggest that what apocalyptic does is it takes that idea of forthtelling and expands it to the globe. It takes that idea of proclaiming in the here and now, but it does so not just for our neighborhood, not just for our county, not just for our denomination, but for the whole of the world, for all of humanity. So in that sense, a pandemic is just it's a moment that's just begging for an apocalyptic response, a prayer that includes a prayer for all people. A text that proclaims that this isn't all there is. That the sense in which a reminder that there is a different kind of future and that God has the last word. So I want to just share with you a book that I recently finished on the 1918 pandemic by Lora Spinney. Her book is called Pale Rider. And of all the books out there right now to read on the 1918 pandemic, you probably could guess why I chose Lora Spinney's. It was not because I read a review of this one and 5 others and made my choice. It was because of her title. I just was so moved by that title because I immediately, oh, and I'm sure we all do, right? We all know the allusion here. What's the Pale Rider about? What about the next slide, Laura, that will give it away? The Pale Rider. Does this ring any bells? The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and the 4 horses and their riders, and of course, the Pale Rider, the 4th one. That relationship between war and then famine, followed by disease and death. There's controversy and lots of conversation about what exactly that white horse represents. But certainly what follows on the white horse is images of war, images of famine with the scales there and the prices that are so exorbitant for food. And then of course, following on famine is disease and death. So Lora Spinney refers to, of course, the 1918 pandemic as the Pale Rider, the rider of disease and death. And I just wanted to remind us of something. It's not always the case in Revelation seminars, but I think it would be helpful to be reminded that these images come out of the seals on the scroll in the book of Revelation. That is, these images are things that are keeping the scroll closed up And John the Revelator wants that scroll opened, wants it clear and the ability to read it. And so these seals are holding that down. There's a sense in which war, famines, death, and disease keep people from seeing God's will, keep us from having a sense of clarity. But God wants that opened up. And so the imagery there in Revelation 6 is the imagery of opening up the scrolls and letting us know that God knows what's in those seals and wants us to know as well. So just another example in art of, notice how the four horses are together in sequence. You can go to the next one now, and we can notice from the book of Revelation, the white horse. I will let you read this on your own. There's the white horse, followed by the red horse of violence and war, followed by the black horse of famine conditions. And again, if you look in the text there, if you're paying a day's pay for a quart of wheat, or if you're using the poor man's food, the barley, 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, you're not staying alive yourself for very long, much less your family. So there's a sense of these are famine conditions and people are going to starve. And then the pale horse of the imagery, the pale green horse, and its rider's name was Death. Hades followed. If you go to the next slide, in a recent article in the Adventist Review by Michael Campbell, he talks about Adventist reactions to the pandemic of 1918. And he notes the work of Dr. W.A. Rubble, who was sort of challenging Adventists at the time. What is the Adventist vision, and how does that make us respond, they were asking, in 1918 to these kinds of conditions? And I love it that he responds with very practical responses that Adventists can do. Can continue to minister to the sick, to make our homes into small sanctuaries, to take seriously our medical missionary challenge, to put it to action. Not just into theory, but to actually put it into action in this very concrete situation. And so I moved again by the idea that a grand global apocalyptic vision is one that doesn't paralyze us. It doesn't leaves us gazing up at the sky saying, okay, God, come anytime now. I don't know what to do in the meantime. No, it's just the opposite. Is that this grand vision that the world is in so need of inspires us and moves us, and the hope of the vision launches us into our world to live now as we will live someday. And that seems to be hope indeed. So I'll turn it back over to Lora, and we want to have some conversation about these various texts that we've been looking at together this Sabbath morning.
Yes, absolutely. We just wanted to give you some further reading. We know this is a very bookish community. And if you're interested in sort of the medical humanities, I really recommend this book, Patience as Art. It really gives you a great intro into how those intersect in such interesting ways. And of course, what we think is one of the best books on the 1918 event here, as well as reading Revelation responsibly. So we just thought it would be fun to kind of share that with you. But yes, absolutely, we are ready for discussion. Please, David, I hope you'll take over and moderate for us.
Oh, you three, I know how to moderate very well. So feel free. Anybody want to jump in right away? I have many questions, both about the course and the administration of the course, but also about the substance of the issues here. But who wants to speak first? Nobody. Okay, I'll start off then, maybe if you want to, real quickly about the course. And then let's get on to something more interesting, I think. But the course medical, no, yeah, what is it called? Healthcare Humanities. Healthcare Humanities. Is that a major, or is that a course, or both? How does that work out?
So yeah, no, it is part of the general education requirement for undergraduates. They need to all take one of these classes called humanities, but they are taught through different sorts of lenses. So a student, we have another one that talks about, say, refugees, for instance, and border issues, that sort of thing. So they have options, and this is a brand new option for that.
And can you change the topic year by year as a teacher?
I think as long as we're meeting those basic learning outcome objectives of learning how to read cultural texts, I think, yeah, we can. Mm-hmm.
And what are the requirements for your course?
So the humanities course as a whole, the team that is part of administering that really has some requirements about a certain amount of writing that will happen, a certain amount of oral presentation that will happen. In our case, Dr. Coe and I, we had them working on a couple of short papers and then building up to a major presentation, and as well as a final exam and weekly quizzes.
Wow, you keep them jumping. Huh. Okay, anybody want to jump in, be sure to do so. Meanwhile, I'll keep going. Forrest, did you have something?
Oh, I didn't, thank you. Well, if you ask me, you know, I find it interesting that the silence of the 1918 epidemic. However, in my family, my grandmother talked about it extensively, so it wasn't secret. I think she lost an uncle, and I think her mother was ill. So we knew that it was quite deadly. And of course, I've read about it through the years, but I've been more surprised with the silence.
As have I. I mean, I hear stories from various families who had been told something about the pandemic. And then I've had students go back and ask their grandparents to talk about it, and they will say, oh yeah, that happened. I don't want to talk about it. So it's been a mixed bag in terms of who's willing to talk about it to the next generation. But yeah, the silence and the history textbooks has been very interesting to me.
John. Go ahead, John.
You have to just talk sometimes.
Oh, you have to, I'm sorry, you have to unmute you. Maybe I can, yeah, there you go. Now
Okay.
we can.
Yes. I guess this question is addressed to Dr. Summitt, but anyone else that's spoken wants to jump in, that's fine. With the Spanish flu in the United States, was there a shutdown of the economy like we're having now?
Absolutely. In fact, not all at once. First, one area, there would be a huge outbreak and a lot of deaths and caskets piled up on the front steps and undertakers having a hard time keeping up. And then a mayor, local officials would say, no more gatherings. So it was after the fact. It wasn't before things got really bad. We're trying to anticipate some of that by shutting the economy down. But some of the pictures from that time period in 1918-19 show empty streets because eventually people stayed away from each other and were afraid that they would catch whatever it was. Many thought it was a bacteria, but the scientists were suspecting otherwise and looking at virus, but still no one knew for sure whether they were going to catch it or not. And how they could prevent it. Nobody had a clear idea of prevention at that point, except to just stay away from each other. So yes, it was a lot of a shutdown, even though there was still manufacturing going on somewhat for the war effort, and then soldiers being shipped to Europe along with the disease germs back and forth.
Okay, well, thank you.
I think LaDon's next.
Yeah, I thank you for the presentation. This was very interesting. What is I wonder the church's response, the organization of the church response toward that presumption of power. Do we have all the answers? Does the Bible give us all the answer? Is it all the solution? And yet it doesn't. And what is the art response, the course's response to the students' viewing of the human power to confront such a thing? If the apocalypse tells us that these things are going to happen, then what is a person's response? I'm not even talking about the Christian. What is my response to such devastation that is going to happen over and over again? What is my responsibility? I think the art that I see is sort of saying this is what it is, and it is devastating, and it touches our souls. But the human response is no. We have it either covered, or we are going to ignore it because we passed by it and we're not going to dwell on it. But I am not satisfied with that. If I'm teaching the course, and I'm not saying that's how you guys will do it. If I'm teaching it, I will have the students do their own art. Do you have them do their art about this? Because the art is devastating. Picasso's art is devastating. It just, it's not our power that responds, it's our powerlessness that responds. And what's wrong with being powerless? Jesus was crucified. Okay. I'm conflicted about that. Because politically, we want to have power, but
pictures.
Religiously, we don't. Spiritually, we don't, and I'm okay with that.
Well, yeah, okay. Let's get Rick in on this as well. All that business about power is perplexing and also troubling, I think, both.
Could I jump in, Dave, before we go to Rick?
Sure.
I appreciate so much what she was saying, and I wanted to just reflect on a couple of things. This is one of the reasons why I think thinking of apocalyptic as predictive events that we're checking off of a list is so wrong and harmful, because instead I would hope that it would be read in such a way, and I would argue that it's more true to the earliest apocalypses, that it's more accurate to have it be like a poem or like a work of art that moves us to respond to the humans around us, that moves us to make a difference in our world today. To me, that is far more in harmony with what these texts are actually doing. So thank you for your passion and your observations. And I want you to know that having sat in Dr. Gerigius's classes, I know that students are not only learning how to be clearer in their reading of texts, including art texts, but also creating. And that is a wonderful combination to challenge people to do.
Laura and April, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I just wrote in the chat back to Layden that I love that idea of a creative project in response. I know quite a few of our students mentioned that they were photographers in their hobbies and that sort of thing. And so some of them had some, skill set for doing some of those things. And yeah, I think that's a wonderful opportunity to, and that's why I'm hoping actually that work by Crystal Chavez, kind of one of their own, a recent alumna, will be part of the course next year as well. But yeah.
All right, I haven't forgotten Rick, but let's go over to April first. Do you want to comment on this, April?
I would just say that in history classes, which I don't get to teach very often these days, but in history classes, what I've had my students do is to construct the missing pieces of history that isn't there by their own interviewing, research, and so forth. So that's somewhat creative, and also finding different ways to express what they learn from the silence, as well as the filling in of the gaps. So the practical part of it is an important piece of learning about text.
If I could jump in with, could I jump in with just one more example in response there? I wanted to say that the students in their final projects had to present a text of their choice, and invariably they chose texts that represented illnesses very frequently that they had experienced in their families. For instance, I can remember there was a really moving presentation about a sort of short film on Alzheimer's that I learned that the girl had experienced that with her grandfather. So the students were finding personal connections even when they were analyzing other texts. It was really powerful.
Okay, thank you so much. You know, I'm going to come back to the three and ask this question eventually, and that is, okay, let's take the point that apocalyptic literature or prophetic literature is about forthcoming rather than forecasting, I guess, something like that. What? Okay, what's the payoff? What's the benefit? What does the Bible have to offer our understanding of this situation that we couldn't find in any other thoughtful, reflective, wise, and discerning commentary? You know, and some of us are facing COVID-19 in our immediate families. And we do have anything to offer other than, isn't it nice to be nice? I would like that. Okay, back to Rick. There you are, Rick.
Dave, I am so moved and inspired by the three presentations that, just a warning, I'll be in touch with each of you individually for more information and conversation. But it's interesting to me, as reading some of the articles that have come out in recent magazines and things like that, to be aware of the tremendous influence throughout Western history of the outbreaks of plague and disease. It's just one thing after another, and I think literature may not focus on it, but it reflects it. I mean, you think of Boccaccio's Tales of the Decameron, when people are quarantined, shall we say, and telling stories to each other. And then we think of we think of Shakespeare writing important plays when he was by himself as a result of an outbreak of the plague. Somebody said recently that Isaac Newton was sent home from the university where he was studying, and it was there that he developed some of his theories of gravity. And so one thing after another, and I kind of wonder if one of the things that we have to face is that what we describe as normal, you know, we keep asking, when do we get back to the normal? If we look through history, maybe what we're experiencing now was the normal for many people. We think of the repeated outbreaks of plague in Europe and the influence there, and some of the great artwork that expressed the gratitude that the plague was over. I think Sacré-Cœur, the magnificent cathedral in Montmartre above Paris, was built as an expression of gratitude that at least one plague had subsided, and they were, you know, there was a return to some sort of widespread health, but other things like that. So I think the idea that Revelation is written to inspire and encourage people during a time of great distress is something that has application to us now, but it may have an application through history to people who discover that they're living in a time of great threat. It's easy for us, with the benefits of modern medicine, to accept as normal the idea that people should come into the world and live what we would call several decades, a normal lifespan, and then look back in history and realize that was exceptional. That was not the normal. And so in a way, I think it puts us in touch with what human beings have been struggling with for centuries and millennia, and realize that we need religion perhaps in a way of restructuring our approach to human life in general, and maybe even the particular time in which we live. So my thanks to all of you. You've given me a new perspective on the normal, in some ways encouraging, in some ways sobering, but in other ways even inspiring. Thank you.
Okay, wow. Does anybody want to comment on whether we are entering the new normal or what? Is this, are we now returning to what life? I'm pausing because how could we live like this forever? We can't all be shut up forever in our homes. So there's a sense in which this is normal, but it's also a sense in which it's not livable. So I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I've tried to figure out when popular sports became active again after the plague of 1918. At some point, people started gathering together in stadiums and having concerts and going to plays and things like that. So, but when did that happen? Did it take a long time? How long is it going to be before we have a football game with 50,000 people there? I just don't know. What's the new normal? Jeff or Donna? I'm not sure which one.
It's always Donna. You know, a couple of things. The program began with the discussion of the silence. I think the silence may be not confined to, but most obvious in the history books. But it was not silent, to tag on with what Forrest said. My grandmother was born in 1900. She lived through the pandemic. She was married to a pharmacist who functioned essentially as the neighborhood doctor. They talked about it, or she did. He had died before I was born. And I think it was also talked about or rumbled about in scientific circles, particularly in medical circles. One of the videos that you had us look at, there was the Swedish physician who went to in the 50s, but he'd begun thinking about it in the 40s after World War II. There were, it was being talked about. It just hadn't transmitted yet to the history books for some reason. The historians weren't talking about it, but other people were. And I wonder if part of that was because when the pandemic ended, unlike the war, there was no victory celebration. It sort of died with a whimper, not with a bang, like wars tend to do, especially if you think you're on the winning side. And it seems to me that the silence has explanations, and that it was a quiet talking, not a.
So let me see if I understand, Donna. Are you saying that April has identified places where it was silent, namely in Lee's textbook, it was silent there, but maybe not silent elsewhere? April, you want to jump in? Where are you?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would agree with that completely. There's the past is never completely silent. There's always someone telling the story to someone somewhere, and certainly we have records and photographs and other things like that that tell the story. But when we talk about the silences in textbooks or in the writings of the time periods that extend over the years, that silence doesn't mean it's all pervasive and everyone is ignorant of it. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that pervasive silence is a lack in our educational system about the past, for example, that future generations, not all of them, have grandparents or great-grandparents or somebody handing down the stories of the past. And so they have to find their knowledge elsewhere, and most of them are being trained to be good citizens in the classroom. So silences in textbooks are a critical piece here. So yes, I did not mean to imply that it was silent overall, but it was certainly not celebrated, like you pointed out so rightly, not celebrated the end of it, because nobody was really sure whether it was going to come back again or not. It had several waves. And then when it was dying out completely, well, that was a great thing, but who knew for sure? It wasn't an armistice treaty where the enemy was defeated and went back to their side and so forth. Yeah, that's a huge part of that factor. Agreed.
All right. Thank you very much. I think I have Bronwyn, then Jeff, and then Eduardo in that order. Bronwyn, do you want to jump in here? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Do you want? I don't see you.
I'm here.
Okay. There. Go for it.
I have a question for April. April, I've been reading that I haven't heard anybody mention any time that the flu lasted, but I read just this week that it was from January 1918 to December 1920. That's 3 full years. Is that what you have picked up in all the reading that you've done?
Yeah, it's not exactly 3 full years with a lot of active outbreaks going on, but certainly the waves of the infections did happen over a 2.5-year period. Really, the majority of it occurred during the latter part of 1918 and into 1919, and then there were some lingering effects afterwards. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Did you want to come back on that, Bronwyn?
I would like to mention something else. Last night I was watching a video by a Professor Bruce Fleury from Tulane University. And he talks about the pandemic of 1918 as a biologist, as an evolutionary biologist. And I've seen more pictures on his videos than I have anywhere else. And it's just fascinating to listen to him. So April, or have you seen any of his stuff or read any of his stuff?
I don't know. I'm going to have to, I think I remember looking at his stuff, and I will be very interested to look at it again.
Uh-huh.
Okay, Bronwyn, what's the name of it again?
Actually, I sent Laura a link last night.
Okay. Those of you, or maybe it's on chat. Okay. The next one I have is Jeff.
Can I respond quickly to Bronwyn?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Bronwyn, I think you would absolutely love the Laura Spinney book, because in it she is, instead of doing a linear kind of study, she keeps going out in different kinds of contexts. So she thinks about it in terms of the medical world. She thinks about it in terms of scientific advancements. She thinks of it in terms of art and how it was, looked at in art. So in different places in the world where it showed up. I just think you would really love her book, given some of your questions.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. People sharing, that's a good thing. Dr. Kao.
I can't turn it off. So I don't have anything more to add than what Donna addressed.
I'm sorry, Jeff, could you say that again, please?
Go away. I
feel hurt. Okay. Eduardo.
Okay, David, in regard to your question, when we go back to normal, I just finished, before the Sabbath school started, Elder Wilson preached at his home church about the post-COVID-19. He said in about a few weeks, we're gonna go back to normal, and then we're gonna have to have a chance for 6 or 9 months of opportunity for the church to witness of the prophecies. I recommend you to listen to his sermon of today. You can find it on Triadelphia Church. He dedicated the sermon about the coronavirus, actually.
Okay, you saw it where, Eduardo? Philadelphia Church?
Triadelphia
What's the address?
You just type Triadelphia SDA Church and you'll see it.
Okay, so he spoke this morning, did he?
Yep.
Okay, that's interesting. He sees a wave and then a lull in which we have an opportunity to share the gospel, and then another wave. So would there be another lull after that? You know, waves at the ocean go like that. Would this be a long series of events? Okay, I was going to go back to Jeff, but he doesn't want to talk.
Comment?
Somebody?
David, can I make another comment?
You bet.
I think that some people cannot bear the prophesied events that are coming on the world. You know, when Jesus spoke about the destruction of Jerusalem, Ellen White said that Jesus didn't separate the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the world because the disciples cannot bear the visions of the destruction of the Jerusalem. And I think some of us cannot bear what is coming ahead of us. It's better to, you know, understand that some people cannot understand it and they don't want to see it because they might commit suicide.
I'll just butt in here real quick with a comment that I have always appreciated not being able to know everything that was going to happen in my life in the next year and the year after that and the year after that. Some mystery is good for coping skills individually for me as well. Knowing our ultimate goal, the kingdom of heaven, is a wonderful thing. Perhaps not knowing every single step of what might happen in your own personal life might be somewhat the best comfort. However, we find strength every time we face the challenge in front of us, one step at a time.
Okay. Somebody else want to jump in? So, what do you folk have to offer that I couldn't find at UCR?
I would, hello? I was wondering, Dave, if I could take a stab at you're challenging us about the text, and I think it's also what you're saying now about what do we have that you couldn't find at UCR. What is it about these texts that invite us to do something other than just be nice? And I think that I want to do a couple of things. I want to respond by very loosely quoting our friend Roy Branson by saying, it takes a global vision to fight a global pandemic vision. So I want to say that. And then I want to respond by saying that the text of the book of Revelation it begins by saying, do not be afraid, which I think is a brilliant beginning. And it ends with a renewed earth. And I'm not saying that all the bits in between are inspiring necessarily, but I do think they're revealing. And I would say that one of the things that people have done when they've looked at this text is that they've discovered that there's something more important than my physical safety. And so I'm willing to put my life on the line. And if anyone's living out the apocalyptic vision right now of the book of Revelation, from my perspective, from my humble perspective, it's the healthcare workers who go in every day and put their lives on the line, literally. I'm so moved by them. And for me, those are so far the heroes of this pandemic. And they're the ones that are saying, I'm not going to be afraid today. I'm going to go in and I'm going to help other people. there's something more important than my own physical safety. There's got to be something better than this. And I'm not pretending to think that they all are reading the apocalypse, but I am suggesting that they're witnesses to living it faithfully.
Okay, what I have written down is the global scope of taking all this seriously. The second thing I've written down is having some buttress against fear, and then being willing to devote one's life to something bigger than oneself. Maybe a lot of you saw the nurse in Arizona, the masked nurse in Arizona, standing quietly in the face of those protesters who wanted to open up the society probably a little too soon. And it took her enormous grace and courage to do what she did after she had done all of her work in the medical center. It was I thought, quite impressive. Okay, anybody want to respond to Kendra? I think that's helpful.
David?
Yes, Forrest.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it was a male nurse that was standing there.
No, there was a woman.
Oh, was there a man? Okay. Okay, my wife says there was both.
Maybe there was more than one.
But yes, I think that's a very moving scene. I wonder if sometimes we try to say that the book of Revelation applies to our day. I know as Adventists, we've done that a lot. I'm not sure that it does, but I do think the messages in Revelation are what is in all apocalyptic literature of evil versus good, and ultimately good wins out. So that could be a message that I could get from UCR or Cal State or La Sierra.
Yeah, but you wouldn't get it with all all that imagery and all that drama and all the sense of being involved in a cosmic conflict. That's what one probably wouldn't get at UCR. I think you get the idea, well, okay, we ought to be helpful, but to position oneself in that global way, as Kendra has suggested, I don't know that one would. Maybe one would.
David,
yeah.
I jump in on that one.
Yeah.
David, I had the opportunity actually to teach at UCR as well as La Sierra. I did my graduate studies at UCR, and so I spent some years as both a kind of a graduate student teaching, and later difference when I moved from that campus to La Sierra was quite stark. A couple things. One, at UCR, when I taught there, it would be a one and done. Like I would teach a student and never see that student again. So that aspect of kind of the lack of personal kind of connection with students. When I got to La Sierra, I was suddenly having multiple opportunities with students, and from both a pedagogical and sort of disciplinary development, as well as a personal level, there was, I think, something very enriching about that for both as a teacher and for the students, that we built those relationships. But the other is kind of quite related to what we're doing here today. I would be teaching literature at UCR. We would come across, I particularly teach British literature of the 17th and 18th century, and that material has religious implications to it, religious imagery. You know, for example, a lamb might wander through a poem at some point, and I can remember at UCR that I could never assume that students would understand the Christian references. So it did become an opportunity to kind of name what those things were, and what even the message of salvation in a way that was coming through some of those things. And I took it as my kind of little personal witnessing opportunity while still couching it within the academic situation. But when I got to La Sierra and would be teaching some of that same material, suddenly we were having a very different conversation. We have a diverse community at La Sierra in terms of religious affiliation, but there is this kind of assumption of the value and importance of it. And so suddenly those conversations really became richer and deeper and more personal. And that's just one of the reasons why I'm so grateful to teach at La Sierra, because we do have that environment for looking at these issues that I think, you know, they can't offer at UCR.
Okay, April and Kendra, do you want to comment on this further before I go to Rodney? Rodney wants to speak, so I'm going to go to him next. No? Okay, let me ask the question a different way. If you were to choose any one passage of scripture that would be most illuminating for our time, would you go to the last book of the Bible, or would you go someplace else first? See, I might go to John 9, right? Who sinned this? I think it's John 9. Who sinned this man or his parents? And therefore, the answer is neither.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Dave, if there was only one person infected. But because this is global, that's why I keep emphasizing that. For me,
how interesting.
It's the global nature of this. It's not if I'm dealing with one person who is ill in my family or even in my church or if I hear somebody in one of my colleagues who's recently been diagnosed, but we're talking about fighting all of it, saying no to all of it somehow, so that the people that are right now working 24/7 to try to find a cure for all of us, to me, that's more the apocalyptic response. And yes, I hope it makes a difference in how we treat the one person that we interact with who's not feeling well. But I'm trying to suggest that larger vision is what's needed in this kind of a time. And so I know you need to talk to other people, not me, about this, but for me, it's a book of Revelation go to. And it's the vision of us all well at the end. That's so moving to me right now in chapter 21.
I find that helpful. That is John 9. We're talking about a particular person in a difficult set of circumstances. But in the apocalyptic literature, we are talking about massive groups and even the whole world. Yeah, okay, good. Somebody else.
David, I want to jump back in here.
Yes.
Maybe the book of Ecclesiastes would be better. Talking about the fragileness of life, the wisp, nothing new under the sun. Maybe that has a better perspective on life than all this happy talk.
You know, I thought maybe next Sabbath we would all come with our favorite text. But what we find to be the most illuminating text in Scripture to read at this time. So we have Ecclesiastes, we have John 9, we have the Apocalypse, but that's for next time. Anybody else want to jump in here? Yes, Jeff. Donna.
He's raising his hand for me because my hand is so small and his is so big, and we thought maybe you'd see it. No. I think it's dual. It's the individual and the community at the same time. You already kind of made a reference to that, but this is the dilemma that has been posed in many medical settings. Is it the public health, or is it take care of the patient in front of you? And that is the kind of the internal dilemma that I think as a physician you face, because your commitment is to both, but immediately the person whose hand you are holding, the person whose chest you are listening to, the person that you are trying to save right in front of you is most important. And somebody calls you to a committee meeting at which some important decision is going to be made for the community, or they call you to the United Nations or to the president's office or wherever. I think that tension is there, but and it's there not just for physicians, it's there for theologians. You know, what was it that Jesus said? Not a sparrow falls, but that God is there and sees. Consider the lilies of the field. It's a whole field, but every lily matters. So I think to separate them and say, well, sometimes the individual is more important, sometimes the community or the global or the world is more important, is to create a dichotomy that doesn't need to exist, and it is a little bit divorced from the reality that we live.
If I remember correctly, Roy, very near the end of his life, maybe he didn't even finish it. He was working on an essay on this very issue, wasn't he? About the tension between serving the particular person and the larger. And I had the feeling that the editors of the book weren't entirely pleased with the way he was going. Do you remember the details of that?
Yeah, you're correct. He was working on it at the end. They weren't very happy, but in fact, it did get published. That book, I believe, if I remember correctly, and I don't have a copy of it, was looking at different religious communities, different different kind of sets of theology, and they were interested because the Adventists, we have so much medical work, so many hospitals, so many clinics, such a strong emphasis on medicine within our religious community. They wanted an Adventist viewpoint, and they posed a hypothetical similar to what I've just said. Your patient comes in, he's having a heart attack in front of you, you're taking care of him, but because of that, you're supposed to be at a meeting at which some great issue of importance to everyone is going to be decided, and you drop the patient and run to the meeting because you know that you have the potential of saving many, or do you stay with your patient there in the room and somehow forego the opportunity to affect the larger group? And yes, that was published eventually, I think, by Oxford University Press, and it's available in a group of essays dealing with that question.
You know, I got into this week with my medical students. I had them read something about in the literature about allocating ventilators when they're not enough to go around, what criteria should be used. And I was a little surprised because a lot of the literature they read said we ought to take into account utilitarian factors, what's best for the whole group. And I said to the students, I said, okay, now I'm going to stop teaching and I'm going to start preaching. So be on guard because I'm not going to hold back. And this is what I said to them. When you're taking care of a particular patient, you're supposed to take care of that patient as your primary and exclusive responsibility. It is not appropriate for you to say, while you're taking care of a particular patient, I think there's some other patient who could benefit more from this ventilation. Once you've committed to that patient, there's only one justification for starting ventilation, and that is a thought that the patient can therapeutically benefit. There's only one justification for removing ventilation, and that is if one thinks that the patient cannot effectively benefit from it. But to take ventilation from one person and give it to another person because one thinks that the second person is somehow more utilitarian, promising from a utilitarian point of view, I just think is to misunderstand the role of the profession. Now, when the doctor takes off his or her white coat and goes down to the community, he or she can engage in the public policy debate. But if I go to a lawyer, I want that lawyer to represent me. If I go to a doctor, I want that doctor to take care of me. But that doesn't mean the global kinds of circumstances are not necessary. I think there are roles that we play, different roles that we play in society, and we ought to be attentive to those at the right time and place. Okay, anybody, let's get back to Lora and April and Kendra, if we possibly can. Yeah, Rodney?
Okay, before you leave this, is Jerry Winslow still with us on this in the class?
I didn't see, did Jerry want to talk? I didn't see Jerry.
I don't know if he wants to talk. I would like him to talk and address it briefly before you start wrapping.
Yeah, Jerry's a specialist in distributive justice, so if he will talk, that'd be great.
Maybe
okay, if he doesn't jump in, we'll go over to Rodney.
Unmute.
You're still muted. Could you unmute yourself? Okay, let me see if I can find you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
I've just got two thoughts on this here. I think on the matter of the relative silence of the epidemic, in my way of thinking, I think when you've got a war like the First World War, the antagonist and the protagonist are very clear. You've got combatants that are very tangible. You've got underlying politics and circumstances. People can talk all day and for a decade, all year and for a decade about that. But when you have things like pandemics, you have this mysterious hand of God, religion, theology. It's a much shorter conversation. Only the intrepid will often go into that. It's harder to record. And so I think the debates are unclear when you've got this intangible hand of God there. And I think that explains it somewhat. You're much more cautious, much more circumspect as to speculate about what the forces are and how the forces are playing out when you're having to talk about a pandemic. But into today's event, in terms of this particular virus, for me, it's a very good time to reflect upon my picture of God. And so if I look at the end result of this coronavirus, it really ends up in its focus on attacking grandma and granddad. And it causes them to fight and gasp for air and drown in their pleural juices, but gasping for air like a fish out of water. And so, is this what my God is telling me? I'm sending you this message so that you will love me more. I'm the God that promised I would come and take you home and give you a place where there would be no more tears. There would be no more suffering. So when my God is about to come, he's going to make it very, very clear to me that he's coming. The idea that he would send a virus out of China that would be indiscriminate, that would attack people, that would take out, in the main, Black people, those that have suffered the most, the obese, grandma and granddad, and have them fight for their breath, is not a God that I would be interested in, and I think it's quite absurd.
Okay, boy, anybody want to jump in on that? You know, I looked up last night in the concordance where the word pestilence is used throughout the text, the whole Bible, and every single time that I can tell, the pestilence is caused by God. Now, okay, so I'm have left asking myself, okay, the Bible writers believed, at least these people at that time, believed that these pestilences were caused by God directly and immediately and for punitive and maybe pedagogical reasons. I don't believe that. Now, you know, what's the bridge between what they believed and what I don't believe? How does one, it's just very clear to me that that's wrong. And yet the Bible says that, so I'm not going to change my view, but I don't know how I get from the text to my conclusion. And I suspect I have to bring something other than the text to bear.
David.
Anybody want to talk about that?
David, let me add that I think it's a very, very great time for us to be as human as we can be and as divine as we can be. But I think we have to be very individually clear about our picture of God and protect it.
I'll just respond.
Okay, let's go back to Lora and Kendra and April. Let them have the final words.
Let's start with Kendra. She was just about to respond there.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the last two comments, which I'm very grateful for. And I would just like to suggest that I think the Bible writers of the New Testament are wrestling with some of those very issues of God being presented in the Hebrew Bible as responsible for these events that destroy so many humans. And I would suggest that that's in tension in places like not only the Gospels, but the book of Revelation, where you're having revealed, right? Apocalypse means revealing, unveiling. You're having revealed that there are evil forces at work in this world that are separate from God, and that God is saying no to, and that God is exposing the way that they work. So if you're concerned with presenting that picture of God as the one behind evil events, please know that so is the writer of the book of Revelation, and is saying, no, please know that this is evil at work in the world, and it is horrible, and we're not in any way sugarcoating this. I love the book of Revelation for that. This is not, we're not trying to say it's easy if you're a believer. No, we're all in this. And everyone's hurting and suffering, and it's very real suffering, but that God's the one who, knowing this and admitting it and seeing it and exposing it, has the last word. And that last word is not injustice and violence and coercion and oppression, but it's justice and righteousness and life and peace. And that's the vision that I'm holding on to for all I can during the time.
Thank you, Kendra. Lora?
I appreciate this conversation and where it's gone, and Kendra's response there. I would say, maybe following up on that, to me, one of the ways that God's omnipotent power is shown is in the way that he can help us lead to having something good come out of evil. Not that he brought the evil for that purpose, but the way that he helps us gain from experiences. And I kind of going back to the idea of the new normal, like, I mean, are we going back to the normal or some kind of new normal? And I hope that we will take lessons from this experience. I mean, think about all the ways that our lives have changed, the way we've had to do things differently, the way that we have moved around less, we've traveled less, maybe we've connected more in other ways, we've done our work differently. You know, the internet is full of stories talking about how this slowdown of the economy has, you know, had some impact on different aspects of the environment, and pollution and different, you know, animal responses, spaces where people are less. And so again, not that these things they will come for these sorts of, if we can take a lesson from some of the things that we've had to learn in the process of this economic slowdown, I hope that we will do that. And so that the normal we go back to won't be the same, but maybe we can find a way to make the world better afterwards as we go back, in terms of equity and justice and less strain on the environment. That, I think, would be a hopeful thing for us.
It has been remarkable to see how much less smog there is in many cities of the world, and how like you say, how the wild animals are moving in. When we moved out, the wild animals, including mountain lions, are right down there in the main street. April.
Yeah, I just have to say that was one of the things that's most striking to me, is the return of animals to different habitats that they usually haven't been, and the lack of pollution. So it's a reminder to us of the beauty of our planet and the impact that humans do have on it, and what we may be able to do to control some of that impact. And as students of history know very well, there's no returning to a normal of a previous time. In fact, there's no going back to the original perfect culture or something like that. Everything changes over time, and we're certainly wondering what our new normal is going to look like, but it will definitely be some parts of the past with an awful lot of something else now coming forward.
Okay, thank you. I said this is it, but Ron Larson has sent something in on chat, and I'd like to read this and see what responses we get, because I don't want to cut this off before he has had a chance to be heard. This is Ron Larson. I am wondering if, given the Adventist perspective that is both global because of our beliefs and because of our geographic spread, whether our public health people have a response to COVID-19 that is any different. Also, whether this gives our church any really significant something to offer to the world at this time. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Is Dr. Sabate there?
I think so. Let me look. I think he's still here. Juan Sabate. Do you want to comment on the role of public health or environmental nutrition on this matter?
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I think I enjoy the conversations and the dichotomy or dilemma, or sometimes contraposition of, you know, the medical medicine versus the community medicine or the public health. There are much to address on this, but let's address this last question. I don't know, I'm not a specialist on that, but I can share my thoughts that I had in the last few weeks. Prevention is at many levels. That's a concept in public health, and there is primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention, so on and so forth. The medical personnel is doing prevention as well, because by curing the patients, and they are able to go home, and then they are able to contain the spread of the disease. However, when we say prevention, typically we refer to things that happen before the subject or the patient has to go to the medical care. So wearing a mask is prevention, being at home is prevention. All of these are preventive actions that we're doing, and these are the ones that are saving more thousands and millions of lives. I mean, this prevention aspect, not the respirators or things of this sort. That's one aspect. But going back to the Adventist Church and environmental nutrition that you mentioned, and this is just a thought, okay? Don't take it as a final say, or that's what I'm proposing, and only that. But most of the pandemics that have happening in the last century are related to zoonosis. That means the transfer from animals to humans. The Spanish flu, some has proposed, for which I don't have data, that coincides with really the factory farming of really chickens and pigs. So I'm talking about 100 years ago. So the issue for the demand of meat that has gone into this factory farming, and has been more and more of these factories being built and constructed in the wild, and has been the possibility for these virus reservoirs that are in the wild animals to transfer to the other animals, the ones that most people consume. So where I'm going is giving just a little bit of a hint that if indeed, I mean, a large majority of people would be having a diet free of animals, probably that will be a way to prevent these pandemics. Because if everybody, let's put in plain and direct, if everybody in the world would be vegetarian, if this is true, that from the wild animals virus comes to the domestic animals and then comes to the humans in one way or another, I mean, probably these pandemics will have never occurred. And this is really the primary prevention, I mean, at the root of the cause. Anyway, this is just an idea to ponder.
Thank you very much. As you spoke, when I could not think, you know, Roy Branson was characteristically upbeat, maybe intentionally so. But he did get melancholy toward the end of his life about one thing. And that he said, I feel like I have, these were his words, I feel like I have failed in my attempt to get the School of Public Health more thoroughly involved with the activities of the School of Religion. That was one of his, you know, that was one of the things, how should I say it? That was one of the things he felt left undone. And I think maybe we need to recover that. It doesn't have to be clinical or environmental. It can be both. After all, John Harvey Kellogg was both, and we can strengthen one side, I think, more than we have. Okay, anybody else on this before we call it a time? Till next time.
David, can I share something?
Yes.
David, I am very concerned of your faith when you said that you don't believe what the Bible said, that the pestilence are caused by God. I just want you to read Deuteronomy 28, where she said, I put before you the blessings and curses. If you obey me, I will bless you. If you disobey me, I will curse you. So I think that we are the deciders. Even though he said, I will do this, I will curse you, I will bless you, he means I will do it. But we are the deciders. And you need to think about it because it's the language of the Bible.
Yeah, I think, Eduardo, I want to acknowledge your comment because that's what's important, isn't it? If intuitively I have a sense that, well, no, that can't possibly be the case, what is that intuition grounded in? So maybe it's an intuition that's not merited. I tend to think it's one that's merited, but I think it's one that merits examination anyway. And if we were to, well, that's a whole nother issue, and let's get into it. But if maybe in a week or two, but how does God participate? I don't even like to use the language of intervention. How does God participate in the flow of history? I think it's a very, very important issue. Well, okay, let's call it quits for now, and then we'll be back together. But thanks to Lora and Kendra and April. Wow. I join Rick in saying that was really, really impressive. Thank you. Lots of work and very beautiful as well. So let's pause for prayer. Yes, Gil is clapping, and we should. Dear God, thank you for these three professors. Thank you that they have shared their time and talent with us. Help us to keep thinking about what they said and continue to learn from it. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.